Welcome to the Block App's second industry presentation. We are happy to have some great content for you today. I know there's a lot of things that have been really talked about in the industry, and as we have really navigated the first half of 2021, we really wanted to share some information with this fine group of people because we've been getting some questions a little bit on the business side, a little bit on the technology side, and we thought it would be very appropriate to blend this all together. So for today, we wanted to give that opportunity to this group of folks. As we proceed through our presentation today, you'll notice we have a very specific Q&A section in the Zoom meeting. Feel free to put your questions in that area, and we will address those at the end of the presentation. For our agenda today, we are working with a couple of things of significance here that'll be great. That is the opportunity to look at the business needs, how multi-party collaboration and traceability in agribusiness is of value. And Stan Dodson will lead us through that discussion. We'll then move to a panel discussion of the industry experts and be able to have some dialogue around what this means in a wider context of both business and technology. Then we'll have an opportunity for Victor to help us out with a demonstration of the TraceHarvest application and really dive a little deeper into private and permission networks as we go. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So with that, I'd like to make the introduction to Stan and his presentation on multi-party collaboration and traceability in agribusiness.
Thanks, Ed, for the introduction. Let me bring my slides up here. I think we're all aware. We're all aware that digital is revolutionizing agriculture. It started on the farm with precision agriculture, but it's now extending into the supply chain. And what it's allowing is new business opportunities and efficiencies that just simply weren't quite possible before. Digital is also allowing some of the trends in agriculture to become realized. For example, we've always discussed how urban growth means fewer people understand how their food is produced. But with digital, they can and still want to know. Consumers are demanding choice. And with digital, we can certify that foods are free from or sustainably produced in fair trade. We're also seeing high profile news coverage of food recalls, 30% food waste issue, and COVID-related disruptions, and these are undermining trust in the food chain. And as a result, one of the actions is that we're seeing retailers and manufacturers that are creating dedicated supply chains that are both back integrated and with fewer players. These trends are demanding greater traceability within the supply chain. And if you think about traceability and why traceability, well, traceability provides the transparency that are being sought after by parties in the supply chain and the data that's needed to optimize food production. Now, often we'll hear traceability defined as field to fork or farm to table, dirt to shirt. For this seminar, we'll use a definition of clear and verifiable record through all stages of cultivation, production, supplying, transporting, processing, distribution. Now, sometimes I boil that down to what I call the 3 Ps of traceability. What product is in what place with which party? Now, when people talk about traceability, it's almost exclusively linked to nowadays to food safety. And this is in part because of the news coverage of food safety incidents, but also the FDA releasing their new food traceability rule. But what I'd like, if you take anything away from this message today, what I'm hoping you can take away is that traceability unlocks new value for your business while enhancing efficiencies and safeguarding your brand. And some of the things that traceability provides, for example, are premium channels for products that might be valued for your customers. By focusing on traceability, you can maintain a consistent supply and avoid stockouts. You can also focus on quality, making sure that products are traced through the supply chain so that they're delivered to higher standards. With traceability and active management of your supply chain, we can tackle that 30% food waste issue. And of course, traceability is really important for food safety. and it ensures that food is safe and the ability to mitigate safety incidents. And lastly, traceability allows us to certify that products meet consumer choice and that consumers can trust in those products. Now, with the benefits of traceability, there are also concerns, which is part of what this webinar is about. If I think about some of the conversations that I've had with people around concerns, things that I hear are, well, if I'm part of a connected supply chain, how am I going to maintain my independence and how am I going to compete on differentiation versus lowest cost? If I'm sharing information with my competitors, how am I going to protect my competitive business information? And if all this data is transparent, am I opening myself up to other liabilities? And then this whole issue of tracking products versus product handlers. What will my employees say if I'm tracking, if they're being part of this tracking system? Now, many of these concerns are going to be addressed, aren't answered, but they're being solved today by early adopters of the platform. And I can share with you that they're going to be addressed in two ways. One is through governance, and the other is through technology. Now, later today in this webinar, Victor is going to show you some examples of how technology can be used to directly address these concerns. But what I'll leave you with on this topic is that the early adopters are going to have a disproportionate input into the governance, and then getting your business involved in traceability early will allow you to address these concerns for yourselves. Now, before I finish, up on this and talking on this presentation, I thought I would also share a few aspects of the TraceHarvest platform. I was fortunate as Vice President of Digital Transformation Strategy at Monsanto and then Bayer to work with Block Apps to design the TraceHarvest platform. And there's a few aspects about it that I'd like to share. First, it was developed ag first. It was built specifically for agriculture, and it continues to evolve to address ag concerns, such as the ones on the previous slide. The platform is all about value sharing. It starts with declaring the value contributed by each participant in the chain and then connecting them. It's about collaboration. It uses digital to connect multiple parties that might use different IT systems and may not have collaborated before. And it's information rich. It aggregates information to drive your digital transformation. A couple other aspects. It helps drive efficiency. Algorithms can be deployed into the platform that will help you optimize your planning, logistics, and risk mitigation. Now, I usually talk about the business value, but I will say from a technology perspective, it's blockchain based. And what's important about that in my mind is that it can be trusted and accessible multi-party record of supply chain events. That means there's no record requests among parties, and it reduces the time or it just eliminates audits. And it's built on an industry standard. Block Apps built a platform based on Ethereum for enterprise. So even if underlying technology evolves, your investment in business logic is preserved. So I'll finish on one slide with one of my favorite quotes from Alan Kay. The best way to predict the future is to invent it. And so if you think about your next steps, how do you invent your supply chain future? So it really boils down to identifying a supply chain challenge that has a narrow scope and a clear value opportunity. Create value-added services by integrating forwards or backwards into your supply chain. And then once that's in place, you can start adding additional collaborators, which will accelerate adoption and expand the value. And this is exactly what the TraceHarvest platform was designed to help you do. And so with that, I'll finish up. I'm going to turn it back over to Sid.
Great. Thank you, Stan. I think we've got real good information that we're presenting here, and great insight on data and data collaboration. We have the opportunity to really take this and kind of review it from a panel perspective. Certainly we'll have Stan here. We also are pleased to have Elizabeth Fastigi with us from AWS as the head of worldwide agribusiness for Amazon Web Services, as well as Kieran James Lubin, our founder and CEO of Block Apps. And I think what we'll do is we'll just have a round of questions here and some open discussion around these topics. Stan, let me start with you first. We covered a number of points there. If you boil it down, what is one point that you would like organizations to take away from your message today?
Thanks for that question. So, as I mentioned, although we hear traceability linked to food safety in the FDA's new food traceability rule, which is important. And you can work with TraceHarvest to be compliant to those rules. What I hope everyone will take away is that traceability unlocks new value for your business while enhancing efficiencies and safeguarding your business. And there are many opportunities, to come together and to better serve a common customer through supply chain transparency and collaboration. So I hope everyone takes away really the value opportunities, as well as allowing them to be compliant with food safety rules.
Yeah, thank you, Stan. On a business level, Elizabeth, to achieve traceability, we need technology solutions that maintain data trust. However, in order to do that, you need to really foster some cross industry collaboration within the supply chains, within your own supply chain, and sometimes with even your competitors at some level. What have you seen, driving some of this cross collaboration, and how can you effectively bring others to the table around this topic of sharing data, where in the past we've been really controlled with our data and very careful with who gets to see what?
Yeah, well, actually, this morning I'm dialing in and joining you from a customer. I'm on site in the middle of a 2-day workshop on this topic, and I think what we are learning in work with our customers is that there is increasingly more recognition that as one entity, you can't do it alone. These are very complex. When we're talking about food systems, right? These are pretty complex value chains with stakeholders upstream and downstream. And everyone, if you're fortunate, everyone in each part of that value chain has really good, robust data. So, in certain parts of the value chain, depending on what we're working on, we may have some work to do on that. But it's actually the ability to share that information in really designing an end-to-end solution that provides that good visibility. So I think we're seeing a lot of heightened awareness around that, and the recognition that by working either upstream with suppliers or collaborating downstream, we can really achieve much more scalable traceability solutions than has really been possible before. And I will say that I certainly agree with many of the themes that Stan outlined. And I think what we've all been through in the last 1.5 years with COVID has actually elevated some of the urgency around a lot of this. So, for a lot of different players within the industry, there were certain supply and/or demand shocks that impacted their operations, and that opportunity to have more visibility upstream and downstream has taken on, I think, a new urgency, and we're seeing a lot more prioritization around that, which again really involves collaboration with stakeholders.
Completely agree with that,
yeah.
Elizabeth.
Yeah, it sounds like you're right in the midst of this topic with clients in real time, so that's very exciting. Kieran, when we think about ways businesses communicate with each other, there's been some long-standing technologies around ERP systems. Sometimes we're working with EDI, being able to do purchase orders, commercial levels, some of those things that are in common practice today. What I'd like to say and ask you to specifically is why now? Why is blockchain the right technology to address some of these confidentiality requirements to allow companies to open up and share a little bit more data while having the assurance that what they share remains confidential?
So this is a great question, and it's a great point that it's not the case that there's no solution today. What we find as we are working with our customers, our partners, is that quite often the lowest common denominator solution is still email and emailing spreadsheets. So on the one hand, call it Enterprise A has a system of record, probably an ERP. Enterprise B has the same. And we find that they do a data export. They find the right records that are relevant to the party, and they email us to the other. And so this solution, it's extremely common, and it obviously does not scale for reasons of just the lack of automation, the lack of data integrity, et cetera. It's also sort of an all or nothing solution. To your point, Sid, there are better solutions in place, still legacy in my view, but EDI is quite commonly deployed in complex supply chains. And I think the challenge that we found with EDI is its ability to scale beyond a point-to-point interaction. So it works fairly well, kind of replacing that CSV export from the ERP to a triggered message to a key supplier when a purchase order is created, for instance. What it doesn't do is any sort of three-party interaction, wider supply chain visibility, reconciling across multiple systems of record. And that's where blockchain technology comes in. So blockchain gives you the benefits of the automated messaging from EDI. It also creates higher assurance in the data, right? So in theory, EDI starts with source data. In practice, there's a translation that occurs, and the data that is in the ERP may be, certainly it'll be truncated, maybe mangled in some way. And as it reaches the other party who has slightly different business processes, maybe a bit of a different standard as how the data looks, quite a lot can be lost in translation. You don't have that problem with blockchain technology. You have an absolute guarantee that the data has not changed in flight in a way that's either accidental or purposefully misleading, so to speak. So these are kind of the trends we're seeing from a technological perspective, but it's really, you need it to scale to do traceability. You can't do traceability just from point to point. We're talking about 10 hops in a value chain from seed to belly, if you will, sometimes more.
Yeah. Yeah, excellent. Yeah, certainly kind of on the new edge of being able to share more information. I know, Stan, as you were going through your selection process, you looked at a lot of technologies. I think you kind of ran into some of the things here that Karen had talked about, and that is, how do you connect visibility across multiple parties, even further down the supply chain where you may not even have a commercial relationship with, because it's been perhaps grower to delivery point. You're kind of out of it from that standpoint as a supplier. Talk a little bit about how you went to solve that problem, and then how you were able to ensure that parties had trust and confidence in the TraceHarvest network and allowed them to say, okay, now we're ready to take that step and share some data and be part of the overall solution.
Yeah, good question, Sid, on that. So, if you think about how companies can interact, I think some of this Karen's already mentioned, but certainly you can interact from one company to the next. And that works well if it's just a few companies, but it gets very complex real quickly when you start adding in multiple companies that you're collaborating with. And then your IT costs just skyrocket. And then now certainly there are also third-party intermediary platforms out there so that you can work with that, multiple companies can work through that third party, but then you have to be comfortable that your business is going to be run through someone else's business. And what blockchain provides is a real technological solution to this, where all the critical supply chain events that you need as a business or that your collaborators need can be real-time accessible by all parties. And there is no information request and no intermediary required on that. And so that's where we started getting comfortable that, okay, collaborators can now come together. And there's really no limit to that. It can continue to scale. So we see lots of examples of these smaller closed supply chain loops now, let's say for some of the alt foods, but how are they going to scale to include a larger percentage of agriculture? And I think this blockchain technology provides that. And then when we're looking at, well, which blockchain technology to adopt, or when you're looking at that, I might share a couple things. So one is the TraceHarvest platform built by BlockApps is built on an Ethereum standard. So I think that's really important that it's built on an industry standard so that that your investment's preserved. And the thing about BlockApps too was that they had completely unlinked it from cryptocurrency risk. And I think that's important as well. There are platforms out there today even that blockchain platforms that to be participant, you also have to invest in their crypto, and that just doesn't work, I think, for most companies. And so those are some things I think you should think about, and why I'm very confident. I think that the TraceHarvest platform, based on BlockApps, based on blockchain, based on Ethereum standard, is a platform that I think the participants on this call should be looking at.
One thing I'd like to add, just on the data privacy perspective, blockchains actually allow a really high level of granularity as far as privacy controls. So instead of being in a situation, so In the previous example, I was talking about, systems of record like the ERP. There's a reason that you don't allow suppliers direct access to the ERP, right? It's because they can see everything in there, and so you have to sort of export the data, and so you're losing the integrity of the source. In a blockchain setting, you can actually share precisely the data you want with the parties you want when you want. So think of this as a single record in a spreadsheet or a database. You can actually take that and only that, share it with the appropriate party. Maybe this is a upstream supplier, downstream customer, and have that party have a high level of assurance that the data is accurate and they'll stay in sync on both sides, and they learn nothing else. So we're not in a situation where you need to share any competitive data with a wider group to join the blockchain. You share exactly the data you like with the parties you like when you like.
Yeah, very good. I mean, I think that's a really core message there and really important for folks to understand as we're looking at this. Elizabeth, I know in your role, you have the pleasure to work with organizations and multiple areas or business focuses within those organizations. So you normally would probably interact with the business unit that has a demand or a drive for traceability, trying to figure out how to get there. You're also working with an IT department that's probably leveraging a lot of your tools already today. Is there some advice that you can provide on how to help manage those interactions between parts of an organization? And is there a threshold of readiness that these organizations need to have in place to start their traceability journey?
Yes, those are, that's a great question, because I think those are common opportunities that we navigate inside the same organization. So the first thing that, when we sit down with a customer, we really start talking through the drivers or those use cases. I think it's important to make sure that, if there are multiple lines of business involved, that we're aligned around the priorities, right? That the use cases that are being articulated, we've got some alignment there in terms of how to think about them and prioritize them. And then with the IT organization, again, it's sort of everyone being brought together around that same, what's the outcome that we're driving towards, or set of outcomes, and, bringing those different folks together and just making sure that we get everybody on the same page. I think also what we always say is there's no need to boil the ocean. So we like to really say to customers, think big, start small, so that we can scale fast, right? Because we're often dealing with organizations that have really big operations, often global in nature. And we really want to, we're with you and certainly share the big vision, but we also want you to have successes early on. The benefits are of implementing a really data-driven approach to traceability. And so we want to really hone in on particular defined use cases and start to develop, proofs of concept or other, even experiments around that. We often talk about that here through the framework of a minimum lovable product. What do you want to sort of put out there for internal and external stakeholders to test and learn from, right? Because then the sooner you do that, the sooner you start getting real-time feedback for how something like this is really working as it relates to your defined and desired outcomes. And that's really important, to start to get that feedback so that then you can build upon that and iterate and ultimately build something that will really work at scale. So those are, I think, very common themes that we navigate with our customers. And then this is also why partners are so important, right? And why we work with partners like Block Apps, because very often there's different types of expertise within an organization. Some may be ready to take all of this on and build themselves, but others may really want to collaborate with a partner that brings particular expertise that can help them get there faster. And that's often, a really important part of those engagements is bringing a partner, for instance, like Block Apps, into that.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments, because that was, you kind of even addressed it, right? Because there's always this balance, right? I think a lot of organizations understand that they would really like to take that step into traceability and do a little bit more exploratory work, kind of focusing on getting started, right? At the same time, it's not uncommon for IT departments to have a full slate of development projects that they're currently working on. right? And so there's a blend of how you get started without providing extra burden on those IT resources within the organization. So, you know, it's a fine balancing act, and I'm sure from your perspective, you can help lead and counsel those organizations to find the best path. You know, Kieran, I would like to ask a question, and this is kind of along that technology line again. You know, in the marketplace, we've been hearing some information about public and private chains and maybe where organizations need to focus. You know, when you set out on this journey, right, I think you made a clear decision that the private blockchain was the best for enterprises. Can you expand on why that is?
Absolutely. And it's a great question. So what I'd like to say is we started with some conception that we might use public blockchains. And in fact, very early on in the business, we did a couple of public events, hackathons, and that sort of thing, and saw real strong interest from corporate IT, even at that time. This was you know, early mid 2015, so a lifetime ago in blockchain terms. But the consistent feedback was, we really love this technology. We have lots of ledgers. The ledgers do not reconcile. Could be, there's a lot of financial interest, but you know, supply chain scenarios coming slightly later. But we don't want to deal with cryptocurrency. Public networks are too slow. What vendor do we use? We need a vendor. You know, we can't use a community-led project if I can't get someone on the phone, if I'm having an issue, right? And so what we at the time termed blockchain as a service was sort of the idea that you would use the technology, but consume it like you do traditional on-premise software in certain cases, but more likely SaaS software as you do today. So making the capability of the underlying synchronized ledger, creating data consistency, transparency across all parties, but not the currency aspects with higher performance, greater governance controls, data privacy. So that's the journey we set out on, and it was really customer driven, right? You know, we are fans of public blockchains, but our strength was in the enterprise, and so, you know, at that time, and still mostly to date, there was not a lot of interest in using public blockchains for those reasons. It was, what do I do with the cryptocurrency? Do I have to buy it? How do I account for it? What does it do to my balance sheet? Now, lately, some folks have liked cryptocurrency from a corporate treasury perspective. That's a new phenomenon. The performance, the privacy, the permissioning, those were the big three issues that moved enterprises from considering public blockchains into the more private blockchain sphere. That all said, we've also found that you don't want single enterprise blockchains to the extent possible. Even permission blockchains you want to grow, but more unified around a specific purpose, aligned to an industry like TraceHarvest. And so at a certain scale, industry blockchains are reminiscent of public blockchains, but with, again, more focused, stronger performance parameters, greater privacy, et cetera.
Great, thank you for that. I think at this point, there's a couple things that I would do. Remind the attendees here, feel free to drop some questions in the Q&A. We'll be fielding some of those at the conclusion of this. Victor, I think we're going to move to you here a little bit and kind of build off of what Kieran was talking about. And this is to give really an opportunity to talk about TraceHarvest technology, the private chain management, and some of the work that you've done from a product side to be able to address some of those client requests that Kieran had just mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Sid. Let me just share my screen. And so I'm really excited today to talk to you about, data collaboration and data confidentiality. I'm going to broadly use the term data privacy to encompass this. But when I talk about data privacy, what I'm really talking about is making sure the right parties have the right data at the right time. And so when you hear that term, match that. I will be digging in a little bit to the technical side of it, because I want to give you kind of a behind the scenes understanding of how it actually works on the TraceHarvest network, because I think the approach we've taken is rather unique, even compared to other blockchain technologies. So to start quickly, just a quick refresher on TraceHarvest. So TraceHarvest is the world's first blockchain traceability network to track the full provenance of agricultural product through their entire life cycle, starting from seeds. I will say this is already expanding to other type of agricultural products, including then we'll have some announcements on that shortly. But how we see traceability, and this quote from Sasha Israel at Bayer Crop Science shows that traceability is really a platform on which other use cases are being developed. So as Stan mentioned earlier, food safety, sustainability requirements, certifications, all of these things are kind of being built out of that raw traceability data that we are creating on the TraceHarvest network. And so the issue comes when we talk about data privacy, kind of going back to what Kieran just talked about briefly, is that you really kind of think about, there's this sort of term private blockchains. And I want to just clarify what we mean by that. So we have public blockchains. As Kieran mentioned, public blockchains are what we think about with cryptocurrencies, right? Bitcoin is probably the most well-known, Ethereum. And there is no privacy by default on those public blockchains. All data is shared publicly among all the participants. Now, one benefit of them is because the network exists already, it's quick to start up, and the upfront costs of kind of just getting on the network are actually pretty low. However, as Kieran already mentioned, it's slow, and you have exposure to cryptocurrency, which is not just the fluctuation of cryptocurrency, but also, the environmental impacts that we've all heard that cryptocurrencies can have. Now, on the right side, you have sort of enterprise blockchains, or, typically many people call them private blockchains. Now, the good thing about them is that data is only exposed to those participants. But the struggles that some people have with them is that they're slow to ramp up and they're higher upfront costs because you're starting from scratch. There's no network there to join. You're building up the network as you go. However, it's very fast, and there are privacy guards in there, and you have no crypto exposure. So with TraceHarvest, we really took a best of both worlds approach. We have a network in place, so you can do quick startup and there's low upfront costs. But we have all the benefits of the enterprise blockchains too. There's no crypto exposure. You have high speed, and you have different levels of privacy permissioning. And I'll go into those in a second. So, TraceHarvest is mapped to the ag industry, as Dan mentioned earlier. So it really is ag first. And this is sort of the basic approach that we've taken. We're tracking the physical seed movement all the way from input provider to the dealer, to the grower, to the elevator, and beyond to the processor and CPG, right? One of the things we've realized is that each of these participants has their own operational systems that they already use. Bayer and other big seed companies use ERP systems or document management systems like DocuSign or SAP. Dealers have their own management systems or point of sale systems. Growers have precision ag systems where they collect data already. And elevators have systems like Bushel, and CPGs have their own systems. So what the blockchain technology allows you to do is really, on an opt-in basis, bring data that you want to collaborate on into the system, but only share it with the right participants. And I'll show you how that works in a second. So I did say we're going to get a little bit technical. So this diagram is the beginning of that. Don't worry, I'll try and walk through it pretty quickly. So in the TraceHarvest network, as I said, we have these sort of levels of privacy. We call it verifiable privacy. So we do have a sort of typical blockchain we call the main chain that is shared among all the participants. Now, most information is not kept there. Really what we keep there is a directory of all the partners that are on the network and public receipts. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But most of the actual data for your company or your application would sit in these ecosystem chains. And these ecosystem chains allow you to keep the data from your competitors, for example, and only relevant to the people who need it. So how does that all work in actual practice? I'll show you that in the application itself. So this is the TraceHarvest application. And what we're seeing here right now is sort of the overall global supply chain view. You start from agreements to the total number of units. And here at this stage, we're tracking bags received, right? So units committed to on those agreements, units received by dealers, units delivered to growers, returns, units planted, bushels harvested, bushels received by processors. Now, I'm going to dive into each of these is powered by a set of agreements. Let me just dive back into it. No, it's a live demo when something like this happens. So I'm going to dive into this individual agreement here. And this individual agreement, you see, is tracking on an individual grower, dealer, processor level, the movement of goods among those parties. So again, like you saw in that global view, you have the movement of physical goods here. And you can see, here there is a dealer already represented. We see the grower, we see the processor. However, that information doesn't have to be available up front. And then here we have all those events. So these events are things like workflow events, or they can be things like grower training events. They can be, grower receiving units from dealers. You can put, for example, sustainability information here, or certification information here. Like if you're looking for a organic certification, all that can be considered an event. Now, each of these events can be made private and only shared by a small number of people. Let me show you how that works. So this is what everything looks like from the blockchain view. Every time we update data, you see these bits of information here, these transactions here. Now, again, apologies, it is a live demo after all. Okay, so each of these transactions you see here, I mentioned receipts. The receipts doesn't contain any information that can be shown about the individual transactions. The data of that transaction or that data being shared can't be taken out by any of the parties. It's simply a kind of unique identifier for the transaction. So later on, if someone wants to verify it, they can. However, if you look at where the actual information is kept, you can see here we have a whole bunch of what we call private chains here. And these, why do we have so many of these private chains? Well, let's dive back. And if you recall, the one I just showed you, the agreement name was 2021 May 100 acres. So you see here, there are actually a series of these private chains. This is a grower chain, which contains information, and it only contains access to be allowed from the input provider and the grower. So I just mentioned that there was a grower training event. That event information would be placed on this chain. And that information is only shared by the input provider and the grower. The dealer can't see that information, for example. Now we have another chain here, which is the dealer-grower chain, where this information that combines information from the input provider, the dealer, and the grower. So you'll notice that their identifications here are all basically encoded. You can't understand from the outside who these individual parties are, but the system who knows who they are when you're participating. So this is the way the privacy model works in TraceHarvest. We have all these subgroupings, and you can send data to each of these individual subgroupings. If you've ever used a kind of messenger system, it's similar to that, where you have, you can send individual messages among two parties, or you can create little groups where you only send information to those parties. That's how TraceHarvest works. And it's all connected together on that main chain through those receipts. So you can always validate that information at a future date. And that's my demo.
Victor, Victor, that's great. Let me ask one question before we move there. You've shown two different, applications, right? With this particular view is the blockchain technology that is operating. Explain that it's operating simultaneously to the user interface that you've shown previous.
Yeah.
Just explain that in just a little bit more detail so we can understand both things that we have just seen here.
Yeah, sure. So the user interface that I showed is just a user-friendly view of the blockchain data. Really, all that data lives in these different chains on the blockchain itself, and it's an easier way. For example, someone in the home office can look at that, or a compliance manager, or the grower can look at that. They don't have to access this. But what I was showing you here is kind of like the behind-the-scenes look on the blockchain data itself. This is how the blockchain sees that data. It sees a bunch of these different private chains that are organized by groups, and it sees where to send that data to when it receives it at any time.
Perfect. Victor, thank you so much for that. I think we're to the point here. We're going to go and talk a little bit about questions and answers as we go through here. Again, with this conversation that we have, go ahead and add those to the Q&A. Remember, there is no question that is too trivial. We're happy to take all of those as we go. The one question that I'd like to start with here is, as you know, in a lot of these, at least in North America, let's say, we've got a seasonal activities for agriculture, right? So if you're going to produce a 2022 crop and we're starting from zero, how long would it take for an implementation, right, to get that first piece of information and the first bit of traceability started in preparation for a spring season? Victor, do you want to handle that one?
Sure, yeah, definitely. I mean, so it really, like I said, the network is available for us to get started right away. So that startup time is immediate. We would have to dig a little bit into the use case that you're trying to do in order to get that data. But really, we've seen pretty quick results in 60, 90 days that we can get something up and running pretty quickly on the network and made for purpose, basically. That would be an initial step, kind of getting back to what Elizabeth was saying. That would be like the first kick of the can, minimum viable product of it. And then we grow from that. So we could definitely do something in time this year for, the growing season in next year's growing season. And we already are tackling projects to do that. Yeah.
There's another question that is of interest, and maybe Elizabeth, you can kind of provide some color here. A lot of consumer companies, CPG companies, have made some sustainability claims in the way they're sourcing ingredients. How do you feel that this technology could support that effort?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty common use case in that we have an increasingly more informed consumer, right? Thanks to social media and lots of other information sources. And I think that many consumer facing brands are responding to that and wanting to provide more information to their consumers, whether it's telling them an origin story or, to sort of develop that, the brand around where that product is from, how it was produced, how it was sourced, where those ingredients may be coming from, or really wanting to comply maybe with some particular certifications or other labeling requirements. And so these are very common opportunities, and certainly wanting that, not only having that visibility upstream, but then identifying ways to verify it in a data-driven way and communicate it is really important. So I think blockchain can certainly serve an important role there, especially when you're dealing maybe with an upstream supply base that may be a little bit more fragmented, where you may have lots of different parties. And so actually having a system where multiple different parties can enter in information, right, and it can be captured in one system and pulled all the way through. There's that's one of the use cases where we've certainly seen a lot of applicability and where that can really be driven by blockchain.
Yeah, thank you. Karen, maybe a question for you. Is the network and platform able to be deployed internationally? and specifically in the African market?
Certainly, yeah, it's a great question. So the answer is yes, and the technology is really agnostic to where it's deployed. There are different levels of adoption of kind of secondary technological systems in different jurisdictions. So in the U.S., the penetration of precision agriculture technologies is pretty high, and so it's much easier to get automated data inputs to the system than areas where the penetration is less high, right? So we don't, to the extent possible, we don't want to create any new manual effort. What we've tried to do from the beginning is take the data from the source, right? So be it the ERP, DocuSign, FieldView, any of the digital systems already in place, aggregate it, and help folks share it appropriately. So if we're in a market where folks are still on paper ledgers, they can derive great value from TraceHarvest. In fact, TraceHarvest will ease just their normal transactional accounting by providing an automated ledger for that, but there will still be greater manual effort than if that data is sourced from an existing system. Also,
yeah, very good.
Yeah, somewhat different business compliance, all that requirements which TraceHarvest can support, but there'll be light customization for those purposes.
Yeah, excellent. Stan, kind of a combo for you a little bit. And I'll bring it to you in two parts. First part is, as you were working with growers and being able to interact with them, how did you address the need for collecting data at the farm level? And then can you expand on some of those successful use cases, or kind of the biggest driver that you saw from that implementation?
A good question, Sid. So I think that when you thinking about a grower, or really any participant, it was around having the conversation about, the future of farming is really around precision ag. And so having that conversation, it would be talking with the grower that, this is another way to get value from your already adoption of precision ag platforms such as FieldView. And or if you haven't adopted FieldView yet, by adopting FieldView, then not only are you participating now in a supply chain opportunity, but you're also improving your on-farm performance. And so it's really about having, and that's true with the grower or any other participant, it's about, participating in the digital ag revolution in the way that you should be, right? As a grower, you should be doing precision ag and getting more value from that by being in the supply chain. And that's a very compelling argument. And particularly, if we're talking about really innovative opportunities in supply chain, those are going to go to the innovative growers or the innovative agribusinesses that want to participate. And those innovative agribusinesses should be using digital at this point. So it's really just around that win-win kind of adoption of digital tools and participating.
Yeah. Care to comment on the success that you've seen driving from that program?
So if I look out at the specific example that Bayer is working with block apps now, we're seeing that at the feedback that we get from the what's required to participate, and then the value that the parties are getting from that, i.e. innovation being brought into ag, has been very favorable. And I think Bayer would continue to support that.
Yeah. Victor, another question that you may be able to handle. How do you integrate with traditional databases, CRMs, et cetera, when customers are already using those and will continue to use them? Talk a little bit about that integration to a blockchain.
Yeah, I actually, like I said before, that was one of the key insights that we had, that we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, basically, and we understand that these systems already exist. So what the TraceHarvest system does is it exposes a REST API. So we basically, those systems can send what data they want to share with other participants into the TraceHarvest blockchain. And then the TraceHarvest blockchain will route it privately to only the participants that they need it. And all of that happens on an opt-in basis. So as I mentioned in my presentation, we have some of those integrations already, but we're adding more quite frequently.
Yeah, very good. Another question, Victor, just a quick follow-up. Will the user experience that you've shown from the TraceHarvest app be viewable on an application, or how, I think what the question is trying to get to is how can that be expanded mobilely, or how we can collect data away from a desktop?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it actually ties back to the original question. So one of the things that we've done is that when we do integrations, we often do them two ways. So for example, integrating with Climate Field View, we not only take data from Climate Field View, we also send data back to it. So many growers, for example, just consume the information on their existing precision ag system. They don't need another interface to work on it. However, in addition to that, what I just showed you before, like in terms of UI, is really just a thin layer over the smart contracts data models that exist on the blockchain. So that can be kind of viewed in many different ways. So it can be viewed in a web interface, like I said. It can be viewed in your existing application by pulling that data back, or it can be viewed, on a mobile device.
Great, thank you for that. A couple other questions as they come through there. Maybe Kieran, over to you a little bit. Can you just speak to a little bit of how we price this model, talk a little bit about memberships to the network, and just kind of highlight, how we can have maybe contributing members versus more engaged network members to help craft and deliver the value that the organizations are looking for.
Absolutely, the pricing question. So generally speaking, there are a few drivers for pricing in our model. One is sort of the level of usage in terms of features, sort of what type of participant are we talking about? So, for growers, right, we are not looking to add a big new IT system for growers. Growers are really adding data to the system, largely from existing sources, and reading data out of the system. And that is a membership tier typically that we would call a contributing member. So they're a participant. They don't necessarily need their own blockchain node. They can be invited to the system by another party, leveraging someone else's infrastructure. And it's just a pure benefit and minimal, and in some cases, no cost. So on the other hand, there are large, the input providers, the large processors, CPGs who have 5,000 people in IT, 10,000, 20,000. Those folks want really direct access to the network, dedicated blockchain infrastructure, a greater level of governance of the behavior of the network, who's allowed in, what is the shape of the data as the system evolves, et cetera. We would call that a network member. And those folks, they're doing quite well as businesses. They're looking at larger subscriptions than a grower would pay. So the big drivers again are kind of what's the usage pattern. Is it a large business putting quite a lot of data within the system? Is it a grower with not too many records, really leveraging the system almost through another system like a field view, like their farm management system? And that will create a differentiation in the cost. And it's a subscription model. In some cases, they'll be, doing like Victor said, 60 days, 90 days of implementation work to get up and running, and that's just a one-time fee.
Excellent. Elizabeth, maybe a question for you. We know that in this review here, we've talked a lot about data at the farm level, at the input supplier level. What are the processors and food companies looking for in order to verify ingredients? Can you share any insight as to how the beginning of this data capture could be valued by those organizations, which heretofore probably had no way to get that level of data?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great example of the ultimate connected value chain in agriculture, because there are so many steps in the process before that product is within the realm of that processing facility, right? So If we look upstream from there, there's data around animal genetics. There's data around animal feed, right? And nutrition and animal health, which is of really strong interest to these organizations because, they're really trying to put in more emphasis on that and actually be able to provide information and insights even upstream to their suppliers so that all of those things can be continue to be optimized and improved. So I think animal health is a really big part of that. And then there's a whole transportation and logistics component. Again, another opportunity to capture information. And then what's happening within the processing facility itself. There's a whole range of ways to really optimize what's happening around, what we call connected factory or smart manufacturing, whether that's energy optimization or predictive maintenance, better capacity utilization, just really optimizing and making those operations that much more efficient. So, all along at every part of that value chain, there's an opportunity for IoT devices and IoT services to capture information in a more automated, scalable way that pulls it into these systems then that Victor and others have been talking about. And there's opportunities to enrich that with publicly available data sets and weather and consumer sentiment downstream, right? So it's really pulling all of these different pieces together to create that holistic view, as well as creating that really robust baseline for then driving insights.
Elizabeth, thank you. I think you've actually touched on some topics that are certainly important to the industry and taken seriously by the Block Apps team. And, there are some nuggets there that may be the emphasis for the next industry call that we have and diving in a little further into those discussions. We are at the top of the hour. Very pleased to have all of you participate from an attendee perspective. To our panelists, Stan, Elizabeth, Victor, Kieran, pleased to have you take some time out of your day to share this information. And we're looking forward to, again, continuing on the blockchain journey and to be able to help your organization whenever you're ready and how we can accelerate this technology step on your behalf. So with that, have a great day, and we will catch you on the next Ag Industry meeting from Block Apps. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ted. Thanks for